It was a crisp, quiet evening in the small town of Willow Creek. The Wilson family had settled into their usual routine. Sarah Wilson sat at the kitchen table, a warm cup of tea cradled between her hands, while the soft glow of the overhead lights cast a calming ambiance throughout their cozy home. The evening's dinner dishes had already been cleared, and the house was now peacefully still. Mark, her husband, was working late at the office, as he often did during the busy season at his firm. Their 2 children, Emma and Lucas, had long since been tucked into bed, their soft breaths filling the silence of the hallway. Outside, the night air was cold, but the sky was clear, dotted with stars. The neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew everyone else, and it was rare for anything out of the ordinary to happen. Sarah had lived in Willow Creek for years, and she loved the slow-paced charm of small-town life. It was the kind of place where you didn't lock your doors at night, where children played outside until the sun set, and the most excitement you could expect was the annual town fair. But tonight something felt off. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it. A sense of unease had crept into the stillness, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She chalked it up to the stress of the week, the demands of work, and the constant running around after the kids. Still, as she sat by the window, watching the trees sway gently in the wind, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was wrong. Her eyes wandered to the clock on the wall. It was just past 9:30 p.m. Mark would be home soon, she told herself, and then everything would feel normal again. But as she took another sip of her tea, a sharp knock at the front door broke the quiet of the night. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. The sound of the knock echoed through the house, deep and unnerving. It was too late for a visitor, perhaps an unexpected delivery, but that didn't explain why the knock had been so insistent, so urgent. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't heard, but curiosity nudged her forward. She stood up and crossed the living room, her footsteps careful and deliberate. She peered through the peephole in the door, only to find darkness on the other side. No one stood there. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was wrong. Still, her hand reached for the door handle. She pulled it open slowly, just a crack, her mind racing through potential scenarios. Maybe it was just a neighbor who had lost their way, or perhaps it was someone who needed help. But as soon as the door creaked open, the world she had known so well shattered. A man, tall and imposing, stood in the doorway. His face was obscured by a dark ski mask, but the malicious gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. In his hand he gripped a crowbar with terrifying purpose, and hanging loosely from his other hand was a gun. The cold steel of the barrel glinted in the dim light of the porch. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. Her mind screamed at her to slam the door, to run, but she was rooted in place, too afraid to move. Before she could react, the man shoved his way inside, pushing her against the doorframe. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming that she needed to get out of this situation. The man's voice was low and threatening as he ordered her to stay quiet and do exactly as he said. There was no question in his tone. This wasn't a robbery that would be solved with a few choice words. Sarah's eyes darted to the hallway, where Emma and Lucas's bedroom doors stood ajar, unaware of the danger creeping into their home. She knew in that moment that her first priority was to protect them. The intruder's footsteps were heavy as he moved through the house, his presence dominating every inch of the space. Sarah stood frozen in the living room, her heart racing, trying to steady her breath. She watched as the man moved toward the hallway, where Emma and Lucas's rooms lay. Panic surged through her. Her children were so close, so vulnerable, but she couldn't let herself break. Her mind raced with strategies, ways to protect them, ways to end this nightmare before it went any further. The man's voice was sharp and commanding, dragging her back to the present. He demanded money, valuables, anything of worth. Sarah's body tensed. She didn't want to comply, but her instincts told her that resistance could lead to something far worse. She nodded, trying to appear calm, trying to hide the fear that gripped her chest. In that moment, her thoughts were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear for her children's safety, disbelief at what was happening, and a desperate desire to do something, anything, that could help her take back control. The robber didn't waste time. He barked at her to lead him to the valuables. Sarah glanced around the living room, trying to remain composed as if nothing was wrong. The furniture, the soft rugs, the cozy atmosphere of her home felt foreign now. She thought of Mark's small stash of emergency cash hidden under the floorboards in the kitchen, something they'd kept just in case of a crisis like this. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to satisfy him for the time being, if she could get to it. She knew that if she could just get him out of the hallway, away from the bedrooms, she might have a chance to protect her children. She motioned for him to follow her, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I have a small stash in the kitchen," she said, hoping he wouldn't notice the subtle shift in her tone. The robber grunted in acknowledgement, his footsteps heavy behind her as they moved toward the kitchen. Sarah's mind raced with every step. She had to think. She had to be clever. As they entered the kitchen, Sarah turned slightly, glancing at the counter where she had left the phone earlier. It was out of reach now, too far for her to grab unnoticed. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in every detail, every possible escape route. The kitchen, though small, was her domain. She knew it better than anyone. But her mind was still clouded with uncertainty. The robber seemed desperate, eyes darting around greedily as he demanded she open the cabinets, the drawers. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, her eyes flicking to the counter. Her heartbeat quickened as she caught sight of something, the crowbar. It was lying on the table within arm's reach. The robber, distracted by his search, had momentarily forgotten about it. A small glimmer of hope flickered inside her if she could just grab it. Without warning, Sarah lunged forward, her hand outstretched toward the crowbar. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles white, as she swung it with all the force she could muster. The heavy steel connected with the robber's arm, causing him to stagger back, momentarily disoriented. His grip on the gun faltered, and it slipped from his hand, landing with a loud clatter on the floor. The room fell silent for a split second, the chaos of the moment lingering in the air like a charged current. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. This was her chance. The robber, momentarily stunned by the blow, was still reeling, and she knew she had only a few seconds before he recovered. But as he reached down for the gun, Sarah's pulse surged, and she readied herself for the next move. Her breathing was shallow, her grip tight on the crowbar. She wasn't sure how this would end, if it would end at all, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't go down without a fight. She couldn't, not when her children were so close, not when everything she had ever fought for was on the line. The silence that filled the house after the brief struggle was almost deafening. Sarah stood in the kitchen, the crowbar still clutched tightly in her hand, her body trembling with adrenaline. Her chest heaved with each breath as she tried to steady herself, still trying to process what had just happened. The man, the intruder, lay on the floor a few feet away, his body crumpled and still. He hadn't made a move since she had struck him, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah wondered if she had ended it all. But a cold knot formed in her stomach. What if he wasn't out for good? What if he was just waiting for her to make a mistake? Her eyes stayed locked on the man as she slowly backed away, her gaze flicking to the hallway where Emma and Lucas slept. Her mind raced with thoughts of her children, locked away in their rooms, unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the heart of their home. She needed to check on them. She needed to make sure they were okay. But even as she moved toward the hallway, the man's presence in the kitchen seemed to fill the space, making every step feel heavier. With each footstep, her senses heightened. Every sound, every shift in the air felt amplified. The quiet of the house now felt like a thin veil over a darker truth, one that had nearly cost her everything. She made her way past the living room, glancing quickly toward the front door, which she had left ajar when the man had barged in. Was it locked now? She couldn't afford to take any chances, but she kept her focus on the task at hand. As she reached Emma's door, she held her breath, standing still for a moment. She strained to listen for any sounds of movement, any noise that might indicate her daughter had woken up. But there was nothing. Only the soft rhythm of her breathing, steady and calm. Sarah's heart fluttered with a rush of relief. Emma was still asleep. She could relax for just a moment longer. Moving gently, Sarah pulled the door open just a crack. Emma lay nestled under her blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful sleep of a child who knew nothing of the chaos that had threatened their world just moments ago. Sarah's eyes lingered on her daughter for a beat longer than necessary, as though making sure she was truly safe. Her mind was still a blur, but seeing Emma untouched, still in her own world, gave her a small sense of peace. She moved to Lucas's room next, the door creaking as she nudged it open. There he was, his small body curled up tightly in his bed, a soft snore escaping his lips. His stuffed bear was tucked in beside him, its floppy ears just visible under the blanket. It was the most normal, innocent scene Sarah could imagine, and yet it felt so far removed from the horror she had just lived through. For a moment she allowed herself to take in the peacefulness of the room, to breathe deeply and let her guard down just enough to reassure herself that her children were safe. They were untouched, unaware, and Sarah vowed to keep it that way. But even as she gazed at them, the weight of what had just happened hung over her like a shadow. The fight wasn't over yet. The sharp screech of the door behind her snapped Sarah out of her reverie. She spun around instinctively, the grip on her crowbar tightening once more. But it wasn't the intruder. It was the sound of her own heartbeat thrumming in her ears, the world around her still too silent. The man was still lying motionless in the kitchen, but something in Sarah's gut told her not to trust it. She could still hear the faintest rustling of his clothing, the slow drag of his breath that barely reached her ears, and then, to her horror, the man's eyes flickered open. The brief moment of eye contact was all it took. His gaze, still wild but clouded with pain and something else she couldn't identify, locked onto hers. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, and Sarah felt the air around them shift. There was something more in his eyes, something that stopped her cold. It wasn't the anger or threat she expected, but a flicker of something else entirely. Was it regret? Desperation? The confusion in his expression was enough to make Sarah hesitate for just a fraction of a second. That split second of uncertainty was all it took for him to stir. He moved, his body slowly shifting as if trying to regain control of his limbs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her thoughts raced, and for a second the horror of the situation paralyzed her. Was he getting back up? Would he come after her again? Her mind screamed at her to move, to act, but her body was frozen, as though the threat of him was somehow too much to fully comprehend. But then he fell still again, his body slumping back to the floor, his head resting at an odd angle. The tension that had gripped Sarah melted away, though the unease remained. Something about him lying there, vulnerable, unconscious, didn't feel like the closure she had hoped for. Was it over? Was she safe? Her breath hitched, but the sound of sirens growing louder and louder from outside reminded her that help was just moments away. Still, she couldn't help but glance at him one last time, her mind trying to piece together this chaotic, brutal night. Why had he come here? What had driven him to this? Was it truly about money, or was there something deeper, something Sarah couldn't yet understand? The answer didn't matter now. The police would deal with him soon enough, but Sarah couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered in the pit of her stomach. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah's heart was still racing, her breath shallow as she stood in the kitchen, her grip tight on the crowbar. The man lay motionless on the floor, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. But he didn't move. The brief moment of calm felt unnatural after the chaos. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and exhaustion hit her like a wave. Her arms ached, her body was bruised from the struggle, but her mind refused to let go of the sharp clarity that had kept her alive. She stood frozen for a moment, watching him, her senses heightened. Could he still pose a threat? Was he pretending to be unconscious? Her pulse quickened again, but she couldn't afford to be complacent. Every instinct screamed that she needed to act, needed to make sure he wouldn't rise again. But at the same time, there was a part of her, something deep within, that questioned whether it was all over. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. As Sarah slowly backed away from the robber, she glanced over her shoulder to make sure the hallway was clear. She needed to check on Emma and Lucas. She had to make sure they were safe. The thought of them alone in their rooms, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding just outside their doors, sent a chill down her spine. They had no idea what was happening. She was the one standing between them and the danger. She couldn't fail them now. The silence was suffocating as Sarah moved cautiously toward the hallway. Her feet felt heavy as she passed the living room and approached the children's rooms. She paused outside Emma's door, her ear pressed against it. There was no sound, just the faint, rhythmic breathing of her daughter. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah's heart relaxed just a fraction. Emma was safe. She moved quietly toward Lucas's room next, her mind still racing. She pushed the door open slowly, careful not to make a sound. Lucas, her 5-year-old, was curled up under his blanket, completely oblivious to the danger that had been just a few rooms away. He was safe. The relief that washed over her was fleeting. The moment she stepped back into the living room, her eyes instinctively found the robber's body. He was still lying there, unmoving, but now something felt different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the exhaustion weighing on her, it was something else. A sense that maybe she wasn't out of danger yet. Suddenly the man stirred, his eyes flickered open, and for the briefest moment Sarah thought she saw something in them, something she hadn't expected. It wasn't rage, but a flicker of fear, of desperation. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a robbery. This man had come to her home with a purpose, one that went beyond taking her things. He was a man pushed to the edge, desperate enough to risk everything. And yet, there was something in his eyes that suggested he didn't want this to go any further. The realization sent a wave of confusion through her. Was he remorseful? Did he regret his actions? But there was no time to ponder that. She had to remain vigilant. He had broken into her home and he had tried to harm her. No amount of regret could erase that fact. He was still a threat. She took a deep breath, her mind sharp again as the sounds of the sirens grew louder, signaling that help was close. But Sarah knew she couldn't wait. The robber might be stunned, but he wasn't fully incapacitated. She needed to get out of the house, to ensure her children were safe and to make sure the authorities could take control of the situation. As she stepped back into the kitchen, she kept her eyes on him. The crowbar was still in her hands, though her grip was starting to loosen. It felt heavy now, like a weight that had to be put down, but she knew better than to relax just yet. She wasn't alone in this house. The man could still get up at any moment, and she couldn't let that happen. When the first police officer finally arrived, he rushed in, taking immediate control of the situation. Sarah barely registered the officer's commands as he handcuffed the robber and checked for any signs of further danger. Her mind was still spinning. She was still processing everything that had happened, the fight, the terror, the split-second decisions that had kept her alive. But one thought continued to echo in her mind. The moment when she had seen the vulnerability in his eyes. As the officers led the robber away, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him go. For a moment their eyes met across the room and she saw something more, something she hadn't expected. It wasn't just fear, it was regret. He wasn't a monster. He was a man broken by his circumstances, by the desperation that had pushed him to the brink. But that didn't change what he had done to her and her family, and that was a truth Sarah could never forget. The door clicked shut behind the officers and she slowly turned back into the house. It was over. For now. But Sarah knew that things would never be the same. The terror of that night would linger in the corners of her mind, but so would the knowledge that she had fought back, that she had kept her family safe. That was the one thing she could hold on to. That was the one thing she had won. The sound of police sirens grew louder now just outside the house, but Sarah couldn't quite bring herself to move. Her legs felt heavy, the adrenaline from the fight leaving her drained, and yet her mind raced. She was safe. For now, the danger had passed. The man who had nearly torn her life apart was unconscious on the floor, and the officers would soon arrive to take control. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unfinished, that the night wasn't truly over. As the front door creaked open and the officers stormed in, Sarah stepped aside, her grip still tight on the crowbar. She tried to breathe, to remind herself that help had arrived. But the sight of uniformed officers flooding the house, their hands on their weapons, made everything feel so surreal. The flashing lights outside, the blue and red colors bleeding through the windows, cast an eerie glow inside, highlighting the scene of chaos she'd just lived through. One of the officers, a tall man with dark hair, stepped forward to assess the situation. He glanced at Sarah, his expression unreadable, and then at the intruder lying motionless on the floor. "Is he the one?" the officer asked, his voice calm but sharp. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure what else to say. The officer crouched down next to the robber, checking for signs of life and confirming that he was unconscious but still breathing. Another officer moved to secure the area, making sure the house was clear, while another checked on Sarah, his eyes scanning her for any injuries. Despite the whirlwind of activity around her, Sarah couldn't seem to shake the shock of it all. The blur of the struggle, the panic, the desperate need to protect her children. It all felt like it had happened to someone else. She was still processing, still trying to wrap her mind around the fact that she had been the one to fight back, that she had somehow survived this nightmare. The officer who had checked on her now stood beside her, his expression softer than the others. "You did good," he said, his voice low, reassuring. "It's over now." Sarah nodded again, but the weight of the words didn't hit her. It wasn't over, not entirely. Her thoughts kept racing, jumping from one thing to the next. What would happen to the intruder now? Was he just a desperate man, or was he a predator who'd been stalking her family for a long time? And, most pressing of all, what would she tell Emma and Lucas when they woke up? She turned toward the hallway once more, her heart heavy with the responsibility she felt toward her children. The officers were taking care of the situation, but she was still their mother. She still had to protect them, even from the knowledge of what had just happened. Sarah felt a deep, protective instinct rise up within her. She would shield them from this horror for as long as she could. The officers were quickly taking statements and securing the scene. Another officer spoke to Sarah, asking her to recount everything from the moment she had heard the knock on the door to the point where she had fought the man off. It felt like an endless loop of questions, but she answered them, trying to keep her voice steady even though her hands shook. The emotions, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of survival flooded her all over again. She could hardly believe that just hours ago life had been normal. She had tucked her children into bed, kissed her husband goodbye, and prepared for a quiet evening. Now, everything had changed. The robber, now handcuffed and groggy, was slowly being led out of the house. His face was still obscured by the mask, but Sarah didn't need to see his expression. She knew he would face the consequences of his actions, that justice would be served. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, something in his eyes, that lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the thought that perhaps this wasn't just a random break-in. There had been something personal about it, something more than just theft. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice calling from down the hallway. "Mom!" It was Emma's voice. She had woken up, and Sarah's heart sank with the realization that her daughter had heard the commotion. Her footsteps were hesitant, and when Sarah turned to face her, Emma was standing at the edge of the living room, her small form silhouetted against the soft light of the hallway. The officer nearest her gave Sarah a knowing look, but didn't interfere. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to explain this all to her little girl. "Mom? What's going on?" Emma asked again, her voice quivering just slightly, though her curiosity was stronger than the fear that tugged at her. Sarah moved toward her daughter, kneeling down to her level. She wrapped her arms around her tightly, shielding her from the chaos that had been raging only moments ago. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. "There was a man who came to our house, but the police are here now and everything is going to be fine." Emma didn't seem entirely convinced, but she clung to her mother, the comfort of her presence enough to ease her anxiety. For now, Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the officers, making sure the situation was under control, and then back at her daughter. For the first time that night, Sarah allowed herself to relax, just a little. The nightmare wasn't completely over. The trauma of it would linger for a while, But as Emma leaned against her, seeking comfort in the warmth of her mother's embrace, Sarah knew one thing for certain. She had survived, and no matter what came next, she would always fight to protect the ones she loved. As the night drew to a close, the flashing lights of the police cars outside slowly faded into the distance, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, her children safe in her arms. The house, once filled with chaos and fear, now felt quiet, eerily so. The adrenaline had worn off, and the emotional weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. Sarah's hands still shook, and her chest tightened as the gravity of the situation hit her all over again. She had fought for her life, for her children, and against a stranger who had threatened everything they held dear. But even as the officers finished their statements and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a mix of relief and unease.